Welcome to this edition of Real World Employment Law, where we discuss real-world issues impacting businesses in the workplace. I'm Declan Leonard. I'm managing partner here at Berenzweig Leonard. I also head up the employment law practice.
And I'm Seth Berenzweig, and I am one of the managing partners at Berenzweig Leonard, and also work in the corporate and transactional practice and help companies navigate through these tough headwinds during this difficult time.
So, Seth, here we are in November. COVID reared its ugly head in March, perhaps even before then, and we never knew how long this was going to last, and we thought we'd hopefully be seeing the other side of it by now. But unfortunately, what's happening is we're seeing an uptick. We're hitting the winter, starting to hit the winter months, and we're unfortunately seeing an uptick. That's impacting businesses. That's impacting the workplace. What do you see going on in the nation with regard to COVID?
Well, right now, I think that corporate America is in a tough spot and in a real bind. We are in an instance right now, as the weather gets colder, that COVID cases are increasing. The ability of businesses to engage in outdoor activities is decreasing. The government is at a bit of a standstill for the next couple of months in terms of a transition.
We just had the election,
Just had the election, and apparently, although it hasn't been declared as official, looks like we're looking at a Biden administration. Small business in particular has really been having a very difficult time. There are a number of statistics that I noticed earlier today that were really quite striking. Yelp issued a study yesterday stating that of all the small businesses that were forced to temporarily close in America, that over 60% of those are going to be estimated to be forced to close permanently.
Wow.
Roughly 1 in 5 CEOs of small businesses in America are doubtful about whether they can survive till Christmas.
So 1 in 5. So that's going to increase the urgency for perhaps in this lame duck session for Congress to act and the president to act. And I don't know. I mean, I'm sure it's a fairly hopeless prospect, but, to provide some stimulus out there.
Well, I think that there's some good news around the corner, but unfortunately the corner is about 3 or 4 months away. And what I mean by that is the incoming Biden administration has issued a new panel to guide us through COVID. And that panel has issued a number of general recommendations that's given kind of a preview, kind of a blueprint about what's going to happen. And it looks very promising. They're talking about providing a new federal finance program to help companies institute certain kinds of equipment in the office, such as plexiglass, other protective elements that's going to be financed through the government. They've talked about a launching of a new rapid testing initiative so that people who go into restaurants and other offices can get a 90% certainty on a rapid test about whether or not they can infect someone. There's going to be a new federal dashboard that's going to be zip code specific to help companies and the public know the exact location and the current status and trends. So there's help. But the bad news is that nothing like that's going to happen for at least the next 90 to 120 days. So we're going to be in a tough spot right now.
Yeah. So we've got a couple of months. Those will be months that we've anticipated. People talk about a second wave, or whether it's still part of the first wave,
or the third wave.
The third wave, who knows?
Right.
But we know the thing is still very real and still very much with us. Businesses, as we've talked about a couple of times in these episodes, businesses have largely tried to open up. I mean, we know that the hospitality industry has struggled, and as we get to the colder months, they're going to continue to struggle. It's been admirable to see businesses just get out there and do the best they can. We've talked about that a number of times, but we do, and that's why we wanted to get in here and talk about issues impacting the workplace and businesses coming up in the next couple of months.
I think the good news is that there's some help around the corner. We're going to be in for a few tough months, but always pointing out, in addition, the good news: the Pfizer vaccine will be distributed beginning in late December. It will be available for general distribution by the end of the first quarter, hopefully. We do have a new set of policies and procedures that are going to be coming in that will particularly helping small businesses. So if we can just navigate through the next couple of months, there is light at the end of the tunnel.
Well, good, because, I missed out on my Def Leppard Motley Crue tickets that were in August. And, I'm worried if we go another year here, they might be in a nursing home. So I'm a little bit worried that I won't get the chance to see them again.
As will half the audience, but that's okay.
That's the thing. They'll do great shows in the nursing home. Tone down the amplifiers.
Right.
A couple of questions that we wanted to go through here today. Can an employer require employees to get tested for COVID? We get that question a lot. Like, whether it's in conjunction with returning back to the workplace, or if there's a suspicion that somebody is symptomatic.
Right. Not only is that an issue that's been coming up in terms of the employer wanting to know, but when that has been presented to the employees, there's been some pushback from the employee because they might be nervous about it. They may not want to know about it. Not everybody thinks it's a good time to have a swab jammed, halfway, up through your head and into your nostril. I've had that.
Yeah, you did that recently. I did the spit one, I guess.
Yeah, I want to know where you went. I should go to your place.
I was a little skeptical though because it seemed way too easy. Nobody was touching my brain, so I figured.
No, you see, that's not fair. That's just not fair. We'll have to iron that out later. But you're right. I mean, it's a major issue, and I'd be interested to hear your thoughts on that. But I think that the short answer is yes. I think that in an appropriate circumstance, the employer is well within their rights to require COVID testing for the interest of safety in the workplace.
In the past, this issue of whenever the employer tried to mandate anything when it comes to testing, medical testing, things of that nature,
health procedures,
it's usually just been an absolute reflexive, no, you can't do that.
Hands off.
COVID changed all that, and because it's so contagious, because it's also so unknown in terms of, how it spreads. I mean, we know a lot, but let's face it, we're going to probably be researching this in retrospect and figuring out where, how it did spread and what were the things that did.
Still figuring
so I think because OSHA requires employers to maintain a safe workplace for everybody, I think employers have a lot more latitude to do so. As you mentioned, as long as they do it fairly across the board, they don't target certain people, target older populations who they might think are more vulnerable. They really do just have to go kind of across the board on that.
And I think companies need to not only do that in a level, equal fashion, but they have to be braced for locking some horns with some of the employees, because I've had a number of clients call in and say, I have presented that as the ask to the employee, the polite ask, although it was essentially a requirement, and a couple of employees are pushing back, and you really have to be ready to stand your ground. So, the idea is not to make the employees have a more difficult environment, it's to have them have a safer work environment, and that's the kind of confidence that hopefully can be imparted by following these rules.
Yeah, there might be one exception to what we're talking about, and it might be if somebody, and I honestly, I can't, I've read this, that, you have to be cognizant of somebody who has a disability, and under the Americans with Disabilities Act, do you have to accommodate them and not perhaps force them to get tested?
Right.
I personally have tried to think of a situation where a disability would get in the way of being tested, because there are multiple ways to test now, whether it's, as you mentioned, up the nostril to the brain, the spit test that I know I've had experience with. The question is whether or not, like, what disability would come into play there. So I would, if an employee did push back and say, I have a disability and I just don't want to do that, I think I would require, as the employer, you go to a doctor and you have a doctor explain to us why you can't go through that.
In detail. I think doctors' notes sometimes get very placed into a generic realm to just say, this person can't do this, or this person can't work. As opposed to, the employer can set the parameters and the specific questions for a medical note.
Of course.
And you would want to know what the basis of that is. Frankly, when I think of disabilities in the COVID realm, I think of that on the flip side. I think of people who are
more vulnerable.
Yeah, because they're going to say, look, I have emphysema, I have a certain medical condition. This is really going to be bad if I get this. Can you please make sure that the staff remains as COVID-free as possible? So, it's a balancing act for employers, but so far, based upon what we know, we believe that you can probably require the testing.
I think that's right.
Yeah.
So as a follow-up to that, you have an employee test positive for COVID.
Right.
What is best practice? We get a lot of these situations in our employment law practice, and people say, do I just need them to be symptom-free? Do I need them to present us with 1 or 2 or 3 tests that show negative for COVID after a period of time? What have you seen, and what have you advised clients in terms of best practice?
This is becoming more complicated as we learn medically more about the virus. recently, the standard practice has been to tell the person to give themselves an adequate period of time, 10 to 14 days, to become symptom-free and to be able to obtain a negative test for return to work.
So you're saying both?
Yeah, but there's been a wrinkle recently, from what I've seen, where there's been recent medical input, given the fact that we're learning more about this every month, that someone may test false positive for up to 90 days, even though they no longer shed the virus, which makes a complicated situation. Of course, congratulations. Now it's even more complicated.
3 months, you're not going to get, you're not going to get paid for that, or maybe you can work remote. Who knows? But
but I think that obviously we want to do everything that we can to help the companies continue to engage in business rather than just throwing in the towel and shutting down. So generally, I continue to take the position, and I'd be interested to see what you think about that. That as long as the person is recovered, symptom-free, and is clear 2 weeks out, it would be preferable for them to test negative. But if they are 2 weeks beyond that and they are symptom-free, then as long as the physician concurs, they can probably come back to work.
Yeah, if the physician gives a return-to-work certification and says, listen, recognizing that these positive tests could either be a false positive or could just be measuring the lingering effects of it, but that it's no longer considered contagious, this person is no longer considered, kind of a danger to be inside the workplace. I think that's right. I think that would be the best approach.
And most people want to go back to work. They don't want to have to, sit at home all day with their cat, doing whatever, although frankly with telecommuting they can still get a lot of work done. So most people want to be able to get back to work. And I like a phrase that you've used and that I have to credit you for, which is companies don't have to play doctor. If you can get some kind of a medical recommendation or certification that the person is symptom-free and it appears that they have recovered, then at least you have something that you can reasonably rely upon.
Yeah, it always concerns me when I hear them saying, well, I think this or that. Or it just gets you into trouble in that.
Absolutely.
You mentioned Pfizer and the vaccine, and very exciting news that came out this week.
Huge.
So can an employer, once we get this vaccine, and obviously there's a lot still up in the air, and even the distribution of it, but can an employer force an employee, all of its employees, to get this vaccine?
I predict this is going to be one of the huge issues, if not one of the biggest issues in January, because people might have religious or other objections to getting an injection. And secondly, quite frankly, and I'm not trying to get political here, I promise, I think that people are going to be skeptical of the virus because they're going to be people that are just going to think it's fake news. And companies are really going to be between a rock and a hard place. It's a great question. Can a company force its employees to get the Pfizer vaccine? And I think the answer to that is probably yes. What do you think?
Back in the day, again, when it came, this has come up a lot over the years, is can an employer force the employees to get a flu vaccine? And the answer generally has been no for flu vaccines. One exception was the swine flu in 2009, where there was a mandatory, the EEOC did approve allowing that to be a mandatory requirement for employers, because it was just it was lethal, it was so contagious. And I think we're in that same territory obviously now with COVID, and so I think that's the issue. I think the two exceptions we still have to keep thinking about it. You mentioned religious. I personally think that because keep in mind, religious exemptions really have to be balanced with whether or not it would be an undue hardship for the company. So it's not just across the board, religiously I can't get vaccinated. Well, guess what? Employers have one analysis above that, and to say, look, is me accommodating you because of your religious beliefs against a vaccine, is that going to create an undue hardship for the workplace? And I think it will.
I think we're looking at a moment of historic rarity. As you've said, and I agree completely, it is extremely unusual for the feds to tell companies that they can instruct their employees medically what they have to do. But we are living in a once-in-a-century event. It's going to really be very interesting, because there's going to be a certain percent of the workforce that's going to refuse. And when the company's going to be balancing that as to key employees, then they're going to be looking at, again, fair and level treatment, because if you don't make this person take it, but you make the other person take it, where do you go with that? So
Yeah.
you really need a policy, and companies need to get ready for this. It's going to be a big issue now that we thankfully do have a vaccine.
Yeah. We've already been doing some of these mandatory vaccine policies for our clients.
Exactly.
Getting them in place both for flu and in the anticipation of a vaccine. The one area that I would say here is for disability. When I mentioned earlier about disability and getting tested, it was hard for me to understand, and again, here I am playing doctor when I should have, but it was hard for me to understand how a disability would impact the ability just to get tested in one of the many ways that you can get tested.
Right.
A vaccine is a different animal, though, because potentially you could see a lot of health impacts of taking a vaccine that may have an impact on somebody's existing disability. So I think that's an area where companies need to be flexible.
Well, you're injecting the person with a virus, right? Now you're doing it at a very low molecular level, but you're taking a person who's healthy and you're injecting them with a virus, and you don't know, because we've never faced COVID-19 before, exactly what's going to happen when you get this virus.
That's right.
Now, don't get me wrong. Thank you, Pfizer. I'll be the first one to line up and get it. I'll be there with the beer, with my sleeve already rolled up.
You're not trying to prop up your stocks here, are you?
No. Well, if I bought it now, it's too late.
That's right.
But yeah, I mean, it's going to be an issue, no doubt.
Next one. So this is interesting. The CDC came out with this. So this is a very relevant question. Somebody tests positive for COVID in the workplace. Who needs to be told? It's the contact tracing that we keep talking about. The contact tracing, not contract. Contact tracing that we keep talking about. Who needs to be told if somebody tests positive in the workplace? Basically being told that, hey, you might be at risk, you should quarantine.
Well, here again, we're back to we knew exactly what was happening and exactly what to do until we were told something else, and now we don't anymore.
Yeah.
So under the recent approach, the feds said if somebody had contact with somebody within, it was either 15 or 20 minutes of a span.
It's 15 minutes.
15 minutes, then that would create a presumption of potential transmission. But if you otherwise didn't spend that block of time with them, then it was markedly
at one time, right?
At one time. And now what has happened recently over the last 2 weeks is that is now calculated in the aggregate. So if you spend, 5 minutes in the morning, 5 minutes in the afternoon, and 5 minutes chatting on the way home that night, there's your 15 minutes.
Yeah,
so,
cumulative now is the way they look at it. Yep. And it's if you spend 15 minutes, as you said, cumulative within 6 feet of a person who tests positive, then you are considered at risk, and then the next step, of course. And so, what it does for companies, I mean, this is an issue, and I'll just throw this out there. People have always when it comes to COVID, they're always saying, well, I shouldn't have to name the person who tests positive for COVID because the ADA requires confidentiality, things of that nature. And I think when you look at a standard that the CDC just came out with, where you can just have really, really inconsequential interaction, I don't know how they're going to not name the person and still be able to do effective contact tracing, because they won't know if I ran into, my colleague down in the hallway. Who knows what I've been doing?
Yeah, it's a HIPAA nightmare also, because HIPAA also requires a protection of medical information, and it gets even more complicated because I've had calls from clients that, and again, not trying to make too fine a distinction here, but what is contact? If one person was with the receptionist, and the receptionist is the person at issue, and one person hung out with the receptionist, and other people were chatting near the receptionist but not immediately adjacent to, how do you treat people differently? How do you differentiate on that? And like you said, how do you anonymize the information of the employee? I think that the company's under the obligation to try to anonymize names and medical information as much as possible.
Yeah.
And at least that way you could specifically be making a good faith objective attempt to try to keep information anonymous, and just to say that there was proximity with someone who is going to be okay, but we believe has tested positive, and out of an abundance of caution, we're going to do the following. But it's very complicated, and I've seen companies really have a hard time because from an HR standpoint, people are going to start to quibble with the company and say, well, how much of what proximity? What do I need to do before somebody starts to, squab my brain?
Yeah. Yeah, no, I agree. And I think, this notion of the first thing I tell clients is go to the employee who has tested positive, who has COVID. I said, go to that employee and try to get their permission.
Right.
Because I think that's really the number one way to do contact tracing.
Right.
I think trying to do it, from an anonymous standpoint, I hear what you're saying and I agree with you.
But
that
get
there
consent.
are sensitivities.
Yeah.
Get consent. There's no real stigma involved anymore. I mean,
Right.
Back in the day, you remember back in the early days, I remember the news breaking in. Breaking news, Tom Hanks and his wife have COVID. And that was either in March or April.
Yeah.
And it was just like, it really hit you. You're like, oh my God,
Yeah.
I know him.
That's right.
He was in all the movies and, he's Forrest Gump. How could that happen?
Right.
And next thing you know, now I think, now that we're 7-8 months into this, we know a lot more people that have it, that have gotten better.
During this show, 5 people from the Trump administration will have contracted COVID.
That's right. We'll need to check. We'll need to check the TV out there for that.
Avoid Mark Meadows.
Yeah. Yes, that's right. So let's just say they do contact tracing. What do you tell your clients? Because this is the thing I think is creating a lot of confusion. You have a case of COVID in the workplace. You do as best you can with this new standard of cumulative 15-minute interaction. What do you do? What do you do in terms of with the rest of the employees who, let's just say, come up as somebody who falls under that new contact tracing standard?
Well, I think that you have to try to draw the line somewhere, and you have to do it in a fair, reasonable, and level manner. And to be able to not only define who's going to be included within who was considered to be in cumulative contact, but to be able to determine who you can exclude. We don't want to. We need to be able to stay in business. We need to be able to continue to have our CEO clients and CFO and COO clients continuing to operate and make money. So you don't want to have to go beyond what you need to do, but by the same token, you also don't want to have a situation where you might face liability later because you didn't take appropriate action. So I think you need to sit down with your HR director or your HR consultant and just make sure that you confirm a plan, and also make sure that you have policies and procedures in place that are in writing, that are available, so that when people know that you're going to be taking a certain approach, there was transparency and communication about what you're going to do and what you're going to expect of
You're right. We've talked a lot in these episodes about communication. In this area in particular, the confusion is so rampant. It's confusion even amongst people who do this like you and I every day. As employment lawyers, there's confusion and it's just rampant. And so you're right. Policies that frankly are evaluated on a weekly, if not monthly basis to make sure, because as we just noted, CDC is changing their standards, and your policies could get you in trouble for creating more confusion.
You know what? Take a look at your one. Do you have a policy? 2. When did you create the policy? If it was created in the first quarter of this year, you may want to take a look at it again. Let me ask you a question, because this is something I'd really be interested to know. We have lived through a very historic time over the last week, and I'm not just talking about the election. I'm talking about the fact that Pfizer has announced that they have a vaccine that is more than 90% effective. It will be distributed starting in December. Of course, it's going to go to people who are at higher risk, as it should, but that we're going to see it being distributed specifically, hopefully within Q1. When do you predict that companies can start to look towards changing their remote workforce protocols? Because right now we're living in an aberration, and I know that the pendulum may not go all the way back, but what's your prediction for next year?
Well, I mean, right now the way most companies are doing it is they've either stayed completely remote or they've done more of a hybrid model, sort of like we've done here at our firm, where it certainly is not mandatory
rotational,
to be in. Rotational, things of that nature. I really think it's not going to be until the warm season of next year, just because, again, getting outside side, and that seems to help the process.
Right.
So I would not expect it until well into Q2,
Right.
which is frankly when the kids are getting out of school, towards the summertime. I think it's still going to be that long. It doesn't mean business is not going on. We see it all the time. Restaurants have already been adapting as best they can. You mentioned the stats that are not very heartening, but restaurants that we've seen, have really done a great job of adapting and staying in business and doing the best they can. So if they can make it through this winter, I think once we hit the winter, the warm months of April, I think we should be good to go.
Well, and the other good news that comes with that is that let's assume that it's going to take us into the warm summer months for everybody to really get their feet back on the ground. That means that hopefully school will be back in session in a regular environment in September.
Yes.
That's going to be a big deal for working parents because that will again help this transition within corporate America
Schools,
to be able to write
camps,
itself.
everything. Yeah, schools,
That's
camps.
exactly
and
right.
what it also will do is this. I read something interesting that they said, with the vaccine around the corner, it may cause people to become more lax. And I think what's actually going to happen is people are actually going to be more careful because they see a light at the end of the tunnel.
Mm-hmm.
So as of right now, people are getting out because they're like, I can't take this any longer.
Yeah, they're going crazy.
But if they know,
I know I am.
Yeah. If we know that through January, February, March that we see, April, May, that's the time frame.
Yeah.
It's going to really change the psyche. It's gonna cause businesses,
Yes.
in my opinion, to boom even more.
Yeah.
And so I think it's.
Look at the stock market.
Yeah, very much hopeful that that's the case, especially if they see from a national level it's being taken seriously. It's being taken with good communication, with good consistent communication coming out. So.
Absolutely. We're getting very close to the end. Companies are doing a great job, and they just have to hang in there and continue to stay coordinated from an HR standpoint. I think that we've been through the worst in the thick of it.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Great discussion, Seth. This wraps up another episode of Real World Employment Law, and we thank you all for joining us.